Everybody knows chapter 11, probably the most well-known chapter of Hebrews, what we call the Hall of Faith. In fact, if you look up on the screen, you see somebody there taking the leap of faith. Again, I'd like to thank Randy Figg for that picture from his vacation years ago. That's him doing cliff diving off the cliffs of, where was that again?
Lake Wawasee.
That's him jumping off the cliffs of Lake Wawasee, getting ready to do a belly smacker into the muck in the bottom of the lake. That's good stuff. And he says, woohoo, taking the leap of faith. Well, from previous lessons, and we won't go into it now, I think we know that that's not necessarily a good description of what faith is, blindly jumping off of something into who knows what and telling yourself it'll be okay even though you know better. That's not really what faith is. That's called gullibility and self-destruction. Faith is something very different. But we're going to look at the Hall of Faith this week in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, I've subtitled, Follow the Leaders. That's really what Hebrews chapter 11 is one great big game of follow the leader. And if you've been paying attention at all for the first 10 chapters of Hebrews, you know what the whole theme of the book is about. The theme of the book is about encouraging the Hebrew believers in Christ not to turn away from the faith that they've acquired and going back to Judaism, turning their back on Christ and going back to what they had before. And he does this through so many different ways by showing how Christ is superior to all the other things they had in Judaism. He does it by warning them multiple times throughout the book, do not stop, don't turn around, don't go back, don't deny the faith. He does it by encouraging them and saying get together, encouraging each other. All these different ways he does to tell the believers not to turn around and abandon their faith. And chapter 11 sticks with the theme just like the rest of the book does. And in fact, we really started to introduce the topic of faith in particular at the end of last week's lesson. And I want to go back and just show you that and kind of pick it up. Start reading back in chapter 10 of verse 38. Yes, chapter 10, verse 38. He's talking about faith and the people there, actually 35. Don't throw away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. In other words, looking for the time when Christ returns, he encourages them. And then verse 38, he says, But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So he looks at those, he says, if you are one of my righteous ones, you will live by faith. And of course, faith and works in terms of salvation we separate out, but in terms of a way of living, they very much go hand in hand. They're one and the same. The faith is what you have in Jesus, and the works that you do demonstrate the faith that you have on the inside. And James talks about that a whole lot, how the works illustrate the faith that you have on the inside. And so in here in this passage and throughout much of Hebrews, really the two kind of go hand in hand. Again, not in a salvation way, we're not talking about that, but the way you behave and the way you live your life demonstrate the faith that you have. So when he says live by faith, that's what he's talking about. So my righteous one, those who follow me and want to do what I want them to do, will live by faith. In other words, they will live out and demonstrate the faith that they have. And if he shrinks back, then my soul has no pleasure in him. I'm not delighted. I do not approve. I do not give my commendation to the one who turns around and says, it's not worth it, or I don't want to do this anymore. I'm quitting. I'm going back. And I am, as chapter 6, I'm re-crucifying Christ all over again. I'm stepping back over the line that said, crucify him. No, he's my Savior. No, never mind. I changed my mind. Go ahead and crucify him because he's not for me. My soul has no pleasure in him, God says. Verse 39, But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed. You don't have to fail. You can succeed. And he's encouraging them. We can all succeed. But of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Don't be one that turns back. Have faith, live out that faith, and therefore preserve your soul. And that leads directly into chapter 11, where he starts to define faith. And again, probably the most well-known couple of verses on all of Hebrews. Chapter 11, verse 1, he says, Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction, or I think King James says the evidence, of things not seen. And he really starts to define faith, or describe it at least, the assurance of things hoped for. What is a thing hoped for? As Pastor says all the time, he's not just talking about a wishful, whimsical type of hope. I hope, I don't know, I hope what? I just hope something happens, but we don't really know if it's going to happen. The hope he's talking about is a guaranteed future promise made by somebody who you rely on, and it's that hope that you look forward to. It's more like if you're getting a little bit older, you're looking forward to retirement. I can't wait till I retire. That is your hope to get you through the last 3 or 4 years of your job, because you have some hope to look forward to, a future promise of something that is coming. You just don't have it yet. And so faith is that assurance of the things that you're hoping for. You have faith that in a few years you'll be able to retire and your savings account will kick in and Uncle Sam won't go broke before all that happens, which my faith in that is not so strong as I'd like it to be by the time I finally get there. But that's another topic altogether. But it's that hope, that's assurance of something you know is coming because the one who has guaranteed it to you is trustworthy. That's the hope that you have. The conviction of things not seen. Again, the emphasis on something that you have not seen or experienced yet. You don't have possession of it yet, and yet you know it is coming at some point in the future. Next verse, he adds, for by it, by the faith, the people of old received their commendation. So he says people in the past have lived by this faith, the faith of something they don't have possession of yet they know it's coming because it's a promise of God. And because of that, living in that faith, they receive their commendation from God. And so he's really setting up a pattern here which describes the rest of each of the stories that we see throughout the rest of this chapter. And it looks like this. You have the faith. The faith is in a promise from God that is hoped for, but never seen, never actually realized, never come to pass yet. But because of that faith and living out that faith, you receive a commendation and a reward from God himself. Okay, everybody have that little scenario, that little cause and effect in your mind? You have the faith. The object of that faith you may not even see or realize even in this lifetime. But because of living out that faith, God gives you commendation and reward because of your faithfulness. Everybody okay? All right. Keep that sequence in mind as we start to look through all of these different stories throughout the book. And the writer here kind of assumes that the Hebrew people already knows these stories. He doesn't go into a lot of detail. He just pulls out the amount of detail and the amount of information he needs to remind them of the story. We're not going to go through all the details of every story either this morning. You can look that up on your own at home if you want to. But he gives us just enough to point out how all these different Old Testament people lived by their faith. And he does it, again, to encourage the modern-day believers in the first century, and us by extension, to say, look, if all of these Old Testament people lived by their faith, they were faithful, they believed in what God said, and they expected the reward for the faithfulness that they demonstrated in God, then they get that reward, and that's what you want to do too. The first one was kind of just a quickie. He says, by faith we understand, verse 3, that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. In other words, by faith we believe that God made all the material stuff of the world by creating it out of non-material stuff of the world. In other words, God made something out of nothing. He made what is visible and what we can see with our telescopes and microscopes and all that stuff today. He made all that out of something that wasn't there before, something that was not visible or tangible. Why does he include that story here in the list of all the other Bible characters? Again, I think he's setting up the whole concept that we will see throughout the rest of them. You start with what is not seen, what you can't grab onto, but through God's word and faith in what he says, now you end up with something in the end that is very tangible and very much real. And again, I think he's just kind of setting up that standard and that mindset. So there's the first story, the creation of the universe. By faith, we know that God did this. He started with something that at the time was not tangible, but by the time he was done, it was absolutely tangible and perfect and just the way he wanted it, and everything was fine and fantastic. Everybody okay? Continuing on. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable or perfect sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Everybody remembers the story back in Adam and Eve's day, and there's the altar, and Abel comes and he offers his sheep, the best of his flocks, and there's blood spilled, and God accepts his sacrifice. And Cain, who is a master gardener, he comes along with his watermelon and zucchini, and he slaps those things up on the altar, and he slices them open, and he sees the juices run out, and says, hey, this is just like Adam's sacrifice, because Adam slit the throat of his sheep, and the juice ran out. I'm slitting the throat of my watermelons and my zucchinis, and the juice is running out. And he offers it up to God, and God says, what? I think you're missing the point. Why don't you go find an animal and sacrifice to me, because that is what I demand of you. So what are we supposed to see from the story? Well, again, Abel, he acted in faith. God apparently had told him, this is how you sacrifice. Cain saw it, he didn't like it, but Abel did what God had requested and required. Abel, acting in faith of what God wanted and doing what he knew to be right, what did he end up getting for it? He ended up getting killed. This is not a very inspiring story to me. You do what is right and you will get killed. But he got killed. In fact, he never really saw, per se, personally, a reward for doing right in this story. Really, right? He clean conscience and all that stuff, I guess. But doing right got him killed. They went out to the field, Cain and Abel. Cain said, hey, I got something to show you here. Abel, whack over the head or whatever, however he did it, buried him in the dirt, and you know the story. But Abel did what was right. He acted according to faith, by faith. He got killed, and he never really saw a reward for doing right, as far as we know within the biblical narrative story. But God did commend him and his sacrifice, and he accepted the sacrifice. So by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteousness. God approved of what he did. And that is very important if you care about pleasing God. Just God's commendation and approval means everything. God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. He's still an example to us by all that. And again, the Hebrew readers of this book are to look and say, oh yeah, he did that. Abel, he stood up to what was wrong. He could have been tempted to acquiesce to Cain or whatever, but he stood firm. He did what was right, even though it got him killed, and even though he saw no reward in his lifetime for it. God commended him, and even today he is an example of this faith. Next story, verses 5 and 6. We turn to Enoch. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was, there's our word again, commended as having pleased God. Again, you know the story from Genesis probably. He's kind of found on a long list of people, a long list of names, and it's saying so-and-so was born, he lived so many years, he had a kid, lived so many more years, and he died. And you go through about 6 of those. Then you get to, I believe it's the 7th generation of Enoch. Enoch lived 300 and some odd years, whatever it is. And then he was no more because God took him. And it said Enoch walked with God, or he was close to God. Again, the supposition is they're kind of in opposition to the rest of much of society. And we know from a couple generations later, when Noah comes along, all the world had turned against God, and all the world was wicked and violent. God said, this is not going to work. I have to kind of start over. So Noah, you're the righteous man. In fact, we're going to look at Noah here in just a second. You build me a boat, and the story goes from there. But Enoch, he walked and he lived by faith with God. He believed in God's reward for a righteous life, and he got God's commendation or acceptance and approval by the way he lived. Now again, in his lifetime, what tangible reward did Enoch get for his faith in this lifetime? Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the Bible really says of a reward per se, other than he didn't have to die. I mean, God took him straight to heaven, and that's kind of neat in itself. But as far as his life on earth here, Enoch was faithful to God. He was taken up. He didn't really see a reward per se. We do know that he looked forward to reward, and he looked forward to the return of I'll say Christ. He looked forward to the end of times because he talks about it in the book of Jude, or he's quoted in the book of Jude talking about it. But he never got to see that day. He looked forward to that day, but he never got to see it. But God commended him for his faithfulness, and he did what was right. Verse 7, Noah. By faith Noah, verse 7, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. I totally skipped a verse, didn't I? I did not mean to. Verse 5, after Enoch, he says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God, like Enoch did, must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So those who live by faith, there's kind of two criteria there. Obviously, you have to believe that he exists, or else you have faith in nothing. But you also have to believe that God will reward those who are faithful to him. And that's an important distinction, and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of. We get so used to, in our world today, where the good guy is always kind of the weak guy who is the ultimate loser in our society, right? I mean, the good guys seem to win in the show and the movies, even if you watch, action movies or whatever. The bad guy is always the guy with the biggest army, the strongest weapons, and he's coming into the battle the most prepared. And somehow the good guy is always the underdog guy, and he always has to figure out a way to win because he just doesn't have the resources that the bad guy does. And that's ultimately, though, that's not the way God works. The good guy, the ultimate good guy, God himself, and the little good guys, us as the followers of him, we know that ultimately he will win and he will reward those who follow him. And to live by faith, you have to believe that. You have to believe that he keeps track of what you do and what you don't do, of who are his followers and who are not, and that ultimately he will reward those who follow him. So without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever draws near to God must believe that he exists and that he does reward those who seek him, that he will make your faithfulness worth your while someday when you see him. Now, to verse 7. Sorry, I did not mean to skip verse 6. By faith Noah, being warned of God as concerning events as yet unseen, that would be the flood, again up to that point, and ever since, they'd never seen a flood or anything like that. And just out of the blue, God says, Noah, I need you to build me a great big boat, and here's the dimensions of it, and you need to build this boat, and then all your family are going to hop in, and we're going to have a great big flood. And Noah had never seen anything like that before, but by faith, he did what God told him to do. Even though I'm sure he was mocked and ridiculed by the rest of society, he tried to preach to them, they rejected him, so he was definitely the outcast, weirdo guy who was building some oddball construction project up on a hill by his house, and he was the weirdo for 120 years or so until the rains came, and then he was no longer the weirdo. Then he was the one who was still alive. But he was warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. In reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. So even though he had not seen a flood, he trusted what God said. He constructed the ark, and in doing so, not just by the boat itself or not by physically hopping out of the water, but by following God in faith as opposed to the rest of society, he did what was right and he saved himself. Again, I think you can really easily see the parallel here of what the writer is trying to teach to the Hebrew first century Christians. This is what you are to do too. Even though society is against you, be faithful. I know you haven't seen any of God's promises come true yet in terms of his millennial reign or his kingship or heaven or anything like that. Right now, it looks like you're on the losing side. But I guarantee you that will be temporary. Have faith that that is only temporary. Someday you will be saved and rescued because God is a rewarder of those that follow him. Continuing on. Abraham, verse 8 through 10. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. Again, there's the element of uncertainty or not knowing or the unseen. He followed God. God said, hey, Abram, pack up your bags, and I want to go to a place that I am going to show you. And that's a difficult request to make. I mean, if God came to me, which I do not expect him to do, said, I need you to pack up your stuff, throw everything in back your pickup, and start driving, and I'll show you where to go kind of on the way. and abandon your house, abandon everybody you know, abandon your job, abandon everything you have, and go to somewhere where I'm not going to tell you where that is. That's a pretty tall order. But Abraham did it. And he packed up and he just started walking or riding or whatever it is he did. He went out, verse 8, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He went looking forward to, not necessarily physically looking for, although, again, it'd be fun to know exactly what was in Abram's mind as he just started walking. Where's God taking me? Is he going to give me a city? What am I going to find when I get there? I don't know. But it says he lived in tents in a foreign land, although he was looking for the ultimate city with foundations. And I think we're kind of supposed to see the contrast there. Ultimately, he's expecting an established, beautiful, glorious city that he will get to live in or to claim as an inheritance. But in the meantime, he's not living in a city, and there are no foundations. He's living in a tent, right? A little mobile home that he has to carry around with him everywhere he goes. And he sets up the tent, drives the stakes in the ground, and that's his home for the night. And he wanders throughout this foreign land which God says, I am giving to you. But at the time, how much of it does he own? How much of it does he own? Absolutely zero. In fact, throughout his entire lifetime, how much of the land of Canaan did Abraham actually own? Not quite zero. There was one little cave that when Sarah died, he bought, and he had to haggle with the natives to get it, and he had to purchase it, and they had to go back and forth, and no, we don't want to sell it to you. Yeah, I want to buy it. Oh, just take it. No, I need to buy this. I need to own this thing. In all the land of Canaan, where God says, as far as you can walk, east, west, north, and south, this whole place I will give to your and your descendants. And by the end of his life, he ended up owning one little cave as a burial plot. That's it. That's all he ever saw in his lifetime. And yet he walked around this place going wherever God told him to go, strictly through faith, even though he never ended up in this lifetime seeing the promise that God had promised him. Now, how did it work out in the long term? Really well. I mean, he followed God's promises. God, of course, comes through on his promises. He has many descendants, and those descendants, at least the Jewish ones, the Israelite ones, the descendants of promise, they come back, they inherit the land, and they take all the land that God had given them. But that was many generations later. In his lifetime, he never saw it. Now, again, put yourself in the shoes of a first-century believer. How important is this to you? This is a great example for you, because God promises you what as a believer, as a Christian? He promises you all kinds of things, but most of all, an eternal glory with him, living with him forever, under his rule and his reign, and righteousness and peace, and all the things that comes with living with God. But in this lifetime, they will never see it. They have to live by faith in this lifetime and behave as if they believe it, which they should, so that they earn that reward when God finally gives it out. Again, continuing on. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of the sand by the seashore. We can picture the event back in Genesis where God comes down and he's talking with Abraham, and God says to Abraham, I know you're getting right up there, but don't worry, I will give you a child, and your descendants will be countless, as many as the stars in the sky, as many as the sand on the sea. And Sarah is standing in the tent just behind the door, and you remember, she overheard the conversation, and she did what? And God says, hey, Sarah, come out here. I have a question for you. And she probably gets a little bit embarrassed and awkward, and she walks out and says, yes, sir. Why did you laugh? Me? Laugh? Oh, I didn't laugh. Oh, yes, you laughed. You laughed at my promise, but don't worry. By the time I come back next year, you will have a baby of your own. Okay. Did she believe him? Hebrews 11 says, yeah. Hebrews 11 says she acted by faith. And because she had that faith, this, 90-year-old granny, she has a kid. And I hope she had some nursery help, because that would be an exhausting first few years for a 90-year-old granny who was a first-time mommy. But she had a kid, And God promised her descendants as numerable as the stars in the sky. Throughout her lifetime, how many children did she end up seeing? She had one kid. Did she ever see the numerous descendants? Well, she saw Isaac, and I forget right now. Did she ever live to see Jacob and Esau? I don't remember. I'd have to redo the math. Does anybody know? Did she live to see her grandkids? I don't think so. If not, then she only ever saw one descendant of hers. That's pretty meager. But she acted in faith. She had the baby, and that baby was quite a baby to have, because that was Isaac, who led to Jacob, who led to all the children of Israel. Now they are God's chosen promised people because she acted in faith. Never realized the promise, never saw it physically, but acted in faith, and she got God's approval, his recommendation, and his reward for that faithfulness. Again, everybody see the consistency with the rest of the book of Hebrews. This is what the whole book has been about. The writer at this point kind of takes a breather, kind of a comma break, to comment on what he's done so far and what he's talked about. He says, looking back at all these people, he said, these all died in faith. All these people that I just told you about, they all died in faith, not having received the things promised. And we've talked about that. But having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. He says none of these people actually got what they were promised. Not that God doesn't keep his promises, but he said they greeted him from afar off. They had confidence. They hoped for that someday those promises would come true, even if they personally didn't get to see it in their lifetimes. And they acted on that promise, and they were faithful. They acted as strangers and exiles on the earth. They didn't go by what everybody else was doing or the way things looked to them at the time. They acted by the faith that they had in God and his keeping of those promises. Verse 14, for people who speak thus, or speak and act in that way, they make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of the land from which they'd gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. They're not living for this life. Their eyes, their goals, their aim is for the heavenly country someday. That promised land, not like physical Israel even, but the promised land where they live with God, where God rewards the right and punishes the wrong and sets everything right, and you get to live in close relation with him. That ultimate reward from God, that's what was their motivation. Verse 16, but as it is, they desire a country that's a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city, talking about the reward that they will get someday. And even though their life on earth might really kind of stink right now, and let's be honest, there was persecution, there's difficulty, there's abandonment, there's being ostracized from your family and friends, all these kinds of things that would have happened to the believers then, all the things they miss out on in this life. But God says, don't worry, I will more than make it up to you someday. And they believe God, and they live like they believe God, and they look forward to that reward that makes all the stuff right now worth it. Whew, that's pretty good encouragement for the first century believers, right? And not bad encouragement for us today as well. If you're getting frustrated or tired of the Christian life and all the things you're missing out on, this is what we focus on, the someday that God promises. The question is, do you have that kind of faith, and will you live by that kind of faith? Verse 17, he kind of turns back to another list of stories, as if this last we've already seen isn't enough. He continues on. Back to Abraham, he says. Verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. People sometimes say, when they talk about the story of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham and Isaac walking up the mountain, and there's Isaac carrying the pack of sticks on his back, and Father, where's the lamb? Oh, don't worry, God will provide a lamb. And God directs Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son. And Isaac lays up there on the altar, and he's bound up and he's tied, and Abraham raises that knife, and I've heard people say, and I'm not attacking them or anything, but they say, God was testing Abraham's love for himself versus his love for his son. God says, do you love me more, or do you love your son more? Are you willing to kill your son for my sake? Who do you love more? And I say, that's a valid question. I'm sure that came into play, but I don't think that was the real test, was it? In fact, we see here, right here in this chapter, it kind of tells us what the test was. God had promised Abraham, he said, Abraham, I will make a covenant to you that through your son Isaac, you will raise up the greatest nation that will be my chosen people through Isaac. His offspring and their offspring and their offspring, they will become a great nation. And I will be their God, and they will be my people, and they'll be numerous, and I'll give them the land, and I'll give them all the blessing. Through Isaac, this will happen. Then God says, Abraham, I need you to take Isaac up, who at this point has no children, and I need you to kill Isaac. Now run that through your logical mind for a second. On the one hand, God promises Isaac will have all the offspring and will be the fulfillment of God's blessing to Abraham. And then God says, Abraham, kill Isaac. If Isaac dies, what happens to the promise of God? It's kaput. It's done. If Isaac dies before he has kids, God's promise is null and void, because God promised Isaac will have the kid to fulfill the promise. So God gives Abraham a really paradoxical command here. I promised you that through Isaac the promise will be fulfilled. Go kill Isaac. So as they're walking up the mountain, probably even more than I don't want to kill my son is the thought, what is God doing here? Which command do I follow? Which promise do I believe? Am I to kill him, or do I believe the promise? If I refuse to kill Isaac, I'm disobeying God. But if I kill Isaac, the promise God gave me will not come true, and I want that promise. Should I refuse to kill Isaac so that I get the promise? Or do I obey God and kill Isaac and null and void my promise? What do I do? I don't know. Well, again, the Bible here in this passage tells us exactly what's going on in his mind. Abraham is thinking, all right, the only way I can figure this out is we're going to go up there, I'm going to stab the knife into his heart or slit his throat, Isaac will die, and then the only thing I can even think of is God's going to bring Isaac back from the dead somehow, because God has a promise to fulfill. I know that God will not go back on his promise. I know he'll keep his promise. So if I kill Isaac, God has to bring him back. That's all there is to it. And what does this verse say? It says, figuratively speaking, that's exactly what happened. Now, Abraham never actually stuck Isaac. He never had to kill him. But figuratively speaking, Abraham gave Isaac up, and God gave him right back. And sure enough, we know God did keep his promise through Isaac, and everything was good. But Abraham had to act on faith of the promise and still be willing to kill Isaac. Again, a fantastic example of faith and faithfulness. So he was told to sacrifice his son. He thought that God would bring him back from the dead, and God figuratively did restore Isaac after all. Next, in verse 20, we pick it up where it says, by faith Isaac, now the next generation, he invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And poor little Isaac, he only gets one little verse here. What's the point with Isaac? So what? So he invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And remember the Bible story. He's getting old, and Jacob and Esau, and there's a little trickery. And Jacob comes in and says, hey, Dad, I'm Esau. Feel my hairy arm, sniff my smelly clothes, and see how sweaty I am. Oh, yeah, you got to be Isaac. Or you have to be Esau. All right, give me the blessing. And then Esau comes in and says, oh, I'm going to pound Jacob because he stole my blessing, that whole story. But the point of this story here is Isaac gave blessing to Jacob and Esau. How does that illustrate the point? How does that demonstrate faith on Isaac's part? He's old, he's blind, he can't see, he can barely even taste and smell. He can't tell goat hair from people hair anymore, apparently. And yet he's demonstrating great faith by giving this blessing. How? Because the blessing is in regards to the fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Abraham, which is through Isaac. And Isaac says, I'm confident that God will keep his covenant and his promise to my dad and then to me. And so based on that promise, I'm going to bless my kids and give them that blessing based on the word of God that he gave. And so I'm going to call them in, and even though I'm old and I'm blind and I can't see or taste or smell very well, and I can hardly do anything, I know that even though I'm not going to see any fulfillment in my lifetime, I'm going to bless my kids according to that promise. In fact, the very next verse then, it continues on, verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Again, all in this passage, all that Jacob does is give blessing, but he gave blessing based on the promise that God gave to Isaac and to Abraham, knowing that it would come true and that someday his family would become that great nation. And he had confidence in that, and so he blessed his kids along those lines. By faith, Joseph, the next one, verse 22, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. What in the world kind of story is this? Gave directions concerning his bones? Just out of curiosity, how many of you remember that oddball little verse at the very, 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 very end of the book of Genesis where Joseph says something about his bones? It's almost a little throwaway statement from Joseph, but sometimes those are the most insightful. And Joseph, as he's dying, he looks at his family and he says, someday Israel's going to get out of Egypt and they're going to go back to the land of promise. And when you do that, do not forget me and dig up my bones wherever they are, whatever box they're in or whatever. I want you to find my remains and take them with you back to the promised land. I don't want to be in this foreign land where I've made a name for myself and I have all my riches and we're all established now and we're all rich and stuff. But this is a foreign land, and I understand that. Back there in the land of Canaan, that's the land that God gave Grandpa Abraham. And someday I want to go back there. So when you guys someday pack up and you head back to that land, do not forget to bring me along. Grab my bones and take them with you. What's the point of that? Is the point of where he gets buried? I don't think it's so much that as the point is I believe in God's promise, and I know that he will fulfill it someday. Someday we're going to enjoy that land back there, not this land over here. Now, it took over 400 years to get there. And sometimes I wonder how long did they have to search for his bones when they left. 400 years is a long time. You can tend to lose things in 400 years. But I hope they found him, yeah. And they carried and they carried him up. 400-year-old bones. Boy, I hope this 400-year-old box doesn't break. I hope they made it well, because that'd be really gross. And they carried him up with them as they left Egypt, and they took him back to the land of promise, just like he said. But it's an act of faith that he would even say that because he knew God's promises would come true. Speeding along, Moses, verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and that they were not afraid of the king's edict. And again, I don't think that just means he was a very adorable baby. I mean, this kid is worth saving. We do not believe that the king is doing what's right. We are going to preserve our baby. That's Moses' parents. Continuing on in verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. And again, I'd love to be in Moses' mind just a little bit as he was in Pharaoh's house. What in the world made him look out at these group of oppressed, afflicted slaves and say, I would rather identify myself with them than be king and Pharaoh of the most powerful nation on earth? I'd rather go with the slave guys. What was it in him? What training? What did he hear? What drew him to them? Even though he was one of their people and he probably knew it, what drew him back to the slave people? According to this passage, it was that faith. Verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward that the Israelites and that the faithful followers of God would receive. And that is hugely impressive to me. This guy who's brought up in the household of Pharaoh, the idolatrous, polytheistic household of Pharaoh, somehow he still had training or insight or drawing back to the God of Israel and said, I'm going to reject all this stuff. I'm going to go be with the slave people because those slave people are going to inherit God's promise, not Pharaoh's house. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And again, somehow he said, I would rather follow God and have Pharaoh angry at me than have it the other way around. And so after he killed the Egyptian, which is probably not the right thing to do, but he fled away from Egypt, and I guarantee you it never crossed his mind saying, someday I'll be back to set you people free. And we know that from his encounter at the bush. He tried to talk God out of it. He said, I'm leaving Egypt and I will never probably be coming back ever. I'm going to go do whatever it is I find out in the wilderness. But he left the king, endured seeing him who was invisible. Verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. God says, here's what you do or else your children will die. He'd never seen anything like that before, nor had the world, but he said, okay, you say it, I'll do it. Paints the blood on the doors, and they survived. Again, things that he had not seen that were not tangible at that moment, but he trusted God, he acted on that faith, and it saved him. Verse 29, continuing on. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. The people had to have confidence that God would deliver them as they walked through this wall of water. Verse 30, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Who thinks that you can conquer a city by walking around and then screaming? I defy you to try that anywhere. Go to South Bend and find the tallest building you can find and walk around it 7 times and then scream loud. See what happens. It probably will not fall down. But God said, walk around, scream really loud, buildings fall down. And he did it. Verse 31, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. It takes a lot of guts to turn on your own family, your own town, your own city, and your own civilization by helping the enemy. But she had confidence, and she knew this enemy was going to win because she'd seen what God did in the Red Sea and Egypt and all that stuff. She knew they were going to win. She said, I want to be on their side, not my side. And she helped them, and sure enough, that faith and confidence saved her and her family's life. 4 minutes, and he keeps on going. He says, verse 32, what more can I say? He was running out of time too, by the way. You can tell. He was looking at the clock saying, oh, my time's about up. For time will fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received back their dead by the resurrection. All these fantastic things that happen through faith, and we say, woohoo, yay for faith, it's great, sign me up for that, that's what I want. Look at all these people who had victory for their faith. They believed in God. God fulfilled their promises. Everything ended great for them. All these mighty miracles happened. And we continue through the rest of the verse where it says, some were tortured. Some were refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in sheepskins and skins of sheep and goats. They were destitute. They were afflicted. They were mistreated. Now I'm not as excited anymore. Do I really want to sign up for this? It makes me cringe just a little bit sometimes when well-meaning Sunday school teachers and preachers and stuff, they tell of the faith of God and these mighty stories, and they say, see, if you follow God like this, everything will turn out just fine for you too, just like it did for so-and-so. And all you got to do is follow God, and things will be perfect for you in your life. And I say, you know what? I'm not sure that's really how it works all the time. Sometimes it can, and God can swoop in and deliver in a miraculous way. Sometimes, however, it does not work out that way in this life. Sometimes people get oppressed, they get persecuted, they get punished, they get ostracized, they get things confiscated. Not here yet anyway, but in some parts of the world they get killed, they get imprisoned, they get tortured. Sometimes faith won't turn out for you so well right here and right now. And again, the question is it worth it to you? Will you follow that faith, whether you're on the victorious, happy side, or whether you find yourself on the I'm being persecuted and probably lose my life side? Because God doesn't promise it'll turn out great for you here and now. He promises a reward someday. And if you are faithful to Him and follow Him, He says that reward will absolutely be worth it. But right here and right now, I want to be honest with you. He says, sometimes you come out on the top and sometimes you don't. But either way, He is worth it. He says, all these people that suffered, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth, lost, rejected by society and everybody. Those are the people the world is not worthy of. And that's what sometimes faith can look like to you too. And he says that to the first century believers here who probably were suffering, at least to some degree. He says, I realize it's difficult, but stick with it, even though right now it doesn't look like it. Look at all these people in the past who put their trust in something they never received right here and right now on earth. But they followed through and they were faithful and they received God's reward ultimately someday. That's what faithfulness is. He concludes with these last two verses here, verses 39 and 40. He says, and all of these, though commended through their faith, God approved of them, and He gave them His stamp of approval. He says, the world isn't even worthy of you because you're faithful to me and you're following what I told you to do. They did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. What you get, the reward you get, is not right here and not in this life. He says you have to be looking forward to the ultimate reward later on for that faithfulness. And that's what the writer of Hebrews has been talking about throughout the whole book. Be faithful, earn that reward, earn God's approval, earn his not condemnation, commendation. Those words are a little too close and they mean very different things. Earn his approval so that someday you get that reward. Do not turn around and turn back, and don't lose that approval, that commendation, that reward. Don't miss out on that. All the things you've suffered so far, stick with it, stay put, keep on going. Just like all these people here in chapter 11 did. It will be worth it someday, even if you don't realize that promise right here in this life. Stick with it. It will be worth it. And that's the Hall of Faith. That's what it's all about. We're going to continue next week, continuing to apply this faith and what it looks like in our lives. But again, that's last week. So let's pray and we'll dismiss. That's next week. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for today, this fantastic chapter where you give us example after example after example of what good faith looks like. And you point out to us that just because they followed you doesn't mean they instantly got rich or famous or popular or successful, because sometimes that happened and sometimes it did not. And whether it happens to us or not here in this life, help us to remember that being faithful to you is its own reward because you approve of it. You're the one that we want to please and not the rest of the world. But on top of that, someday you promise to make it all worth our while with the rewards that you will give us and the opportunity and the privilege of living with you forever. Help us to be motivated by that and to focus on that in our lives. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.